U.S. loses last AAA credit rating and a potential U.S. default in August. Is it still safe to own Treasuries? Hello, members, super savers, and bond course fans. I hope you're healthy and well. So we got a bit of reprieve on the tariff front this week, and equity markets largely recovered. But as so often in recent months, it seems the next thrill ride is already awaiting us on this roller coaster parade, as you can see from this Wall Street Journal headline that just crossed our desk. U.S. loses last AAA credit rating. Moody's, the last of the three big ratings agencies, finally downgraded the U.S. from its perfect AAA rating. And on top of that, there is the looming specter of another possible government shutdown. And talk that the U.S. could face a default by August if Congress doesn't address the debt ceiling, according to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. So, with that in mind, here are the three topics that we'll be covering in today's video. 1. Why are bond yields up again? 2. Will the U.S. default on its debt in August? And 3. Where do things stand with Trump's big, beautiful budget and more bill? Let's find out how we ended up here and where this might all possibly lead us. As usual, here's a front video disclaimer. For a detailed disclaimer, please refer to the end of this video. Let's dive in now, folks. Why are bond yields up again? So this past week didn't start too badly. On Monday, we saw some measure of stability return to the markets after Treasury Secretary Bessent held successful negotiations with China that brought both sides back to the negotiation table on tariffs. Important equity market indices like the S&P 500 have by now largely recovered from the losses they had sustained, and the S&P 500, for example, is now even slightly above where it was at the beginning of the year, even though it hasn't reached its February highs again. And as so often in the past, when share prices went up, bond prices fell, meaning bond yields rose again, especially at the long end, as our bond community knows. The 20-year Treasury ended the week at a 4.97% yield and even briefly crossed the 5% yield line again on Wednesday and Thursday. Now, this inverse relationship between rising equity prices and falling bond prices isn't that surprising. In fact, the assumption that equities and bonds will balance each other out, so to speak, has been the de facto expectation for a long time and is a basic foundational principle for how an investor can diversify a portfolio. And the explanation is basically that as the economic outlook improves, as the higher equity prices seem to indicate, rate cuts become less likely and bond investors will demand higher yields. In fact, JP Morgan's chief economist reduced the likelihood of a 2025 recession in the U.S. from 60% to below 50%. That said, with everything that's going on, there is currently more noise around this explanation than usual. Are rising bond yields really reflecting an improving outlook for the economy? Or are they actually a risk premium that investors demand because they fear higher inflation from tariffs and our ongoing budget deficit? And maybe they see the credit quality of the U.S. deteriorating as well, and even fear the next government shutdown. No one knows for sure. But let's move on now to the next section and have a look at what the latest is on the U.S. government potentially running out of money in a few weeks. Will the U.S. default on its debt in August? So, Treasury Secretary Bessent essentially posed an ultimatum to Congress. The federal government could be unable to pay its bills as soon as August if Congress doesn't act, urging lawmakers to address the debt limit by mid-July. As our community regulars know, our federal government has been facing two fiscal challenges for a long time. First, it spends more than it earns, and the ever-increasing borrowing that's needed to plug this gap regularly runs up against a debt ceiling that Congress then needs to raise in order for the administration to continue borrowing. Now, this has happened more often over the past years than even many professional observers can keep track of. And in most cases in the past, and after some political theater, so to speak, Congress did raise the debt ceiling just in time to avoid the government running out of money. In the few cases where Congress didn't do that, we had government shutdowns that suspended some government services and sent a part of the federal workforce into temporary furloughs. The last time this happened was actually towards the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, under President Trump's first administration. That said, in all these episodes, all administrations under presidents from both parties took great care to make sure that the debt service of the federal government did not stop. Regular interest payment and all principal repayments continued as usual at all times, and the full faith and credit of the U.S. was maintained. Now, we here at Diamond NestEgg continue to believe that the playbook may be very similar again this time. We hope for a last-minute agreement, or maybe even a resolution a bit earlier. But even in the worst case of a government shutdown, we expect debt service to continue seamlessly, as in the past. So on that front, we're not too worried, at least from our perspective, as owners of U.S. Treasuries. That said, it's hard to know for sure these days, and we'll keep monitoring the situation, and we'll let all of you know how things develop. But the debt ceiling isn't the only problem. The second fiscal challenge that all administrations have been facing is this. Our government hasn't been working with a proper budget for a while now. In fact, the last time a proper budget was signed into law before the start of a new fiscal year was in 1996 under President Clinton. Since then, all administrations have been relying, at least for a while, on continuing resolutions from Congress that give the administration the authority to continue spending taxpayers' money for a certain time. It's no different this time, and the current continuing resolution will expire on September 30th of this year. So even more pressure on the government here. Plus, budgets are the laws that essentially determine whether our national debt will keep growing or not, bringing us nicely to the next section of today's video. Where do things stand with Trump's big, beautiful budget and more bill? As we talked about previously on this channel, the Senate approved its draft budget bill a few weeks back on the weekend of April 5th and sent its proposal to the House. And now, after many internal discussions that took longer than many would have hoped, the House seems to be close to finalizing, advancing, as the legislature says, its own draft bill. They still hope to put the final agreements in as soon as this weekend, although it seems that some more high-pressure, last-minute talks will be needed as some conservative Republicans are still demanding changes before they will allow a vote in the responsible House committee. But more about that later. Regardless of whether the House will advance the bill this weekend or not, though, we still won't have a final budget for a while because there are still many steps to take before Senate and House will both have agreed to a final version in the reconciliation process that can then go to President Trump's desk for signature. Nonetheless, the current discussions may give us a good idea of the direction this is going. So, let's have a look at where Congress stands and how this may impact our country and our treasuries, which are, after all, dependent on the ongoing creditworthiness of the U.S. And let's start with the deficit. And I'll give you the bad news right at the beginning. Both the House and Senate would allow our deficit to grow even more. No sustainable budget consolidation here. That said, the deficit that each chamber would allow is quite different. And please note that the numbers I'm about to give you try to forecast the expected deficit increases over 10 years. This is done so lawmakers don't play too many games, so to speak, by just pushing some expenses into the next year. But even if you divide the numbers by 10 to get a feeling for the annual impact, the continuing growth of the deficit is still staggering. As the Nonpartisan Committee for Responsible Federal Budget reports, the House would target a net deficit increase of $2.8 trillion over 10 years, while the Senate is even less strict and proposes a net allowable deficit increase of $5.8 trillion. For comparison, our total national debt stood at about $36 trillion at the end of fiscal year 2024, equivalent to 123% of our national GDP, according to the Treasury. And yes, we as a nation haven't been that much in debt in a while. Now, we will only know the exact deficit increase that we can expect when the bill is finalized and signed. But adding a few more extra trillion in debt over the next 10 years doesn't sound too good. And in the worst case scenario, may deter prospective buyers of treasuries. And this state of discussions seems to have finally convinced ratings agency Moody's to take the highest credit rating of AAA away from the US. This just happened on Friday after market close, as you can see here from Moody's own press release. And by the way, in finally downgrading the US from their top rating, Moody's is following the other two big ratings agencies, S&P and Fitch, who both already have downgraded the US by one notch to AA+ a while ago. Now, when S&P and Fitch downgraded the US, they still gave our debt their second highest ratings, like Moody's just did. And S&P's and Fitch's AA+ ratings for the US have remained at those levels since their downgrades. And frankly speaking, neither we nor many other observers could notice any significant changes from these downgrades in the daily Treasury markets so far. But there's no guarantee that it stays like that. So it's definitely something that we, in this community of Treasury holders, will need to keep an eye on as creditors to our nation. And remember, nothing in Trump's big beautiful bill is really set in stone yet. We can probably expect a breakneck 2 weeks of negotiations in the House as Republicans split over budget deficits, energy policy, healthcare, and taxes try to wrangle a majority for the plan, as the Wall Street Journal reports. But back to the current version of the House bill, what seems to have worried Moody's enough to trigger their downgrade. Let's have a closer look to get a feeling for the direction in which it's going. Our overall headline impression is that this budget bill is less organized around one large goal, like balancing the budget, but more about the political agenda of the administration, which is generally trying to provide some tax relief, but often only for very specific situations. So let's revisit the tax priorities that President Trump laid out shortly after his inauguration that we spoke about in this recent video and see how close the current version of the bill gets to keeping his promises. Priority 1, no tax on tips, as in gratuities, not Treasury inflation-protected securities. This is in the bill and even written in a way that independent contractors such as Uber drivers can claim it. However, while this tax break would start in 2025, it would expire again after 2028. So a temporary relief only as it stands, and unless it gets extended again. Priority 2, no tax on Social Security. The bill, as proposed, does not make Social Security tax-free, nor does it adjust the low thresholds for the different tax brackets, as has sometimes been proposed as an alternative. However, there is a provision that would grant an additional $4,000 standard deduction to all people aged 65 and older, on top of all the existing deductions. But even this extra deduction would only be available from 2025 through 2028 and start phasing out from an income of $75,000 for individuals and $150,000 for married couples. I can only assume that full tax relief for Social Security payments would have been too expensive at this point. Priority 3, no tax on overtime pay. This is in the bill, but just like the tax exemption on tips, would only apply in full from 2025 through 2028 as it stands. Priority 4, renewal and extension of the 2017 tax cuts from Trump's first administration. This is in the bill as proposed, and there are even some additional tax relief measures aimed at middle-class households and families, such as temporary boost to the standard deduction and the child tax credit. If confirmed in the final version, this will probably remain the single most expensive provision in the budget by far. Priority 5, adjust the SALT cap, the limitation of how much in state and local taxes can be deducted from the federal tax bill. As proposed, the limit would be increased from $10,000 to $30,000, but phase out for taxpayers with incomes above $400,000. Now, there are some voices from high-tax states that are still pushing for a larger increase to the SALT cap. And to be honest, I am conflicted here as a resident of a high-tax state. Let's see where this one will go. Priority 6, tax cuts for Made in America products. The current version contains several provisions in that direction, including favorable depreciation rules for the cost of production upgrades and tax incentives for research and development. The National Association of Manufacturers has already endorsed these proposals. And finally, Priority 7, deductions for car loans, a priority that Trump added a bit later to his list. As it's currently in the bill, up to $10,000 per year in loan interest for U.S.-made cars would be tax deductible, but only from 2025 through 2028, and phasing out once income reaches $100,000 for an individual and $200,000 for a married couple. Now, because there are no free lunches in life, as our representatives know as well, let's look at how they propose to pay for these tax cuts. And let's start with the 2 tax increases that President Trump proposed initially. First, close the carried interest tax loophole. This loophole allows managers of private equity and hedge funds or other private funds to pay taxes on a substantial part of their compensation at the reduced capital gains rates, as opposed to the full income tax rates. However, the bill as it stands leaves the rules as they are, and this is not the first time an attempt to abolish the carried interest tax loophole has failed. Second, eliminate tax breaks for sports team owners. Trump seems to have been more successful here, and deductions associated with purchasing sports teams would be limited. But just the elimination of tax breaks for sports team owners won't pay for the proposed tax reductions. So, Congress added a few more ideas of its own to increase government income and or reduce expenses. So, let's have a quick look at the most relevant ones. Third, end the tax credit for purchasing new electric vehicles at the end of this year, with a limited extension of 1 year for some smaller manufacturers. Fourth, phase out tax credits for renewable energy and battery production between 2029 and 2031. Fifth, increase the taxes that universities and foundations pay on their annual net investment income. Remember, most of these endowments have historically been tax exempt, and this proposal would make them pay up to 21% on net investment income, similar to the capital gains tax rates for individuals. Sixth, introduce a new 5% tax on certain payments to residents of foreign countries, with some exceptions, including for many payments sent by American citizens. And seventh, reduce spending for Medicaid and nutrition assistance, food stamps. The details are still unclear here, but I think it's fair to say that this proposal is one of the most controversial ones in the current text. These first few proposals from Congress seek to increase government revenues, with the last one here targeting government spending. Unfortunately, even all the currently proposed initiatives to raise more revenue for the government will not close the gap, but rather leave our deficit substantially larger than it is now. And that's the reason some conservative representatives are currently holding up the bill. They are proposing to tighten Medicaid work requirements and remove clean energy tax credits faster in order to narrow the expected shortfall. So this should be an intensive and interesting weekend, especially for those of us who are heavily invested in Treasuries and care about the financial health of the U.S. as both a creditor and citizen. The one thing that is clear is that the credit worthiness of the U.S. may be on the line. Does this worry you? Are you concerned about a possible U.S. default in August? Or are you planning on picking up even more Treasuries should yields spike next week or as we get closer to the summer? Drop a comment below and let everyone know. And if you fall into the latter, less concerned, more opportunistic category, then check out this video here on our bond courses to learn all about bond investing and building out a bond portfolio while rates are still attractive. Use coupon code BONDS2025 to get an additional 10% off of our popular bond course bundle before the end of May. The 10% coupon code BONDS2025 can also be used to purchase bond beginners or bond masters individually. And come join our next live member Q&A on Thursday, May 22nd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. Pacific Time. We'll be diving deeper into the 2, 5, and 7-year T-note auctions and all things fixed income. I've linked all the details on our bond courses and our YouTube Super Saver membership below this video for your convenience. See you again very soon with more brand new wealth building content for your financial journey.